Hello, my name is Brian McDowell, and I would like to welcome you to today's discussion, which will centre on the changing face of banking in Ireland, and in particular the effect that change has on older people. Over the last few years, hundreds of bank branches have closed across the country, ripping the social fabric from many of the main streets in towns across the country. Staff numbers have been dramatically reduced by all the main banks, making it very difficult to get face-to-face conversations with a staff member. Access to cash has been withdrawn from many areas. And now, on top of all that, Ulster Bank and KBC are withdrawing from the market, forcing over 1 million customers to change banks. It is fair to say that today we will have a lot to discuss and a lot of topics to cover. With me today are Sue Shaw. Sue is the Chief Executive of the Irish Senior Citizens Parliament. Sue has over 20 years of experience in the community, development and voluntary sectors, where she has worked at local, regional and national level. Sue has a degree in youth and community work and a master's in applied social studies. Sue has been the CEO of the Irish Senior Citizens Parliament since 2020 and has a long track record in the sector of supporting the rights of older people. Nat O'Connor is a Senior Public Affairs Policy Specialist with Age Action. Nat has over 15 years of experience working on social and economic policy, as well as a Master in Politics and Social Policy and a PhD in Politics. Nat previously worked in the Dublin Homeless Agency and in the think tank TASC. He worked for the Labour Party in the Oireachtas, as well as Ulster University and Maynooth University. He has contributed to a range of publications, including Ireland's first comprehensive report on economic inequality. John O'Connell is the General Secretary of the Financial Services Union. John has extensive experience of industrial relations, human resource management and business, with over 30 years' experience working in Ireland, Europe and the Middle East in the communication, finance, aviation and healthcare sectors. John has been vocal over many years in support of workers and community and consumer rights. You're all very welcome today. Sue, can I turn to you first? The Senior Citizens Parliament has over 250 organisations affiliated to it. Represents over approximately 50,000 people. So it's fair to say that you represent a considerable amount of people in the sector. Could you give me your views, how the changes made to the banking infrastructure over the last few years and the rush to digital banking has on people you represent? Would you agree perhaps that the social fabric in many towns across the country has been changed and not for the better by branch closures and other changes that have been made over the last 12 months or so?
Absolutely. A lot of our members over the last few years have been hugely concerned by what they see as the loss of, I suppose, across a range of areas, but in terms of the social fabric, how they see it is that once the bank closes, there's an element of vibrancy moves out of the community. So when older people head down to the bank to do their business, they end up going maybe for a cup of coffee. It's business into the community. There's a strong sense that the community has a hub and a centre. For older people, once the bank closes, and if that's matched by other closures as well, say of the credit union movement, then there's a sense of the centre of their community is no longer there. And they strongly feel that the point of going out and interacting with people is lost. The idea that you would go to your bank and you do your bit of business, you'll meet the people you know, you'll end up going for a cup of coffee. You begin to notice when somebody isn't around. You begin to realize, oh, John hasn't appeared this morning. And after a while, that's something that there's like a checkout for each other. So the sense of a community begins to disintegrate when we start to pull services out of it, particularly services that add, particularly when they're services that are vital.
Thank you for that, Sue. Nat, may I turn to you now? Change happens in every sector of the economy. Why do you think the changes occurring in banking are causing so much concern to the people that are represented by Age Action? In particular, you might touch on the challenges of the financial independence of older people and how the inability to access the banks compounds that problem.
Absolutely. There's a lot in all of this. So, when we talk about older persons, there's 1 million people in Ireland who are age 60 or older. And there's 350,000 who are 70 or older, 180,000 who are 80 or older, and certainly plenty of people in their 90s and even in their hundreds. So you have a very large population, and you have a lot of diversity in that. So I certainly echo everything that Sue was saying about the loss of community. Already back in 2016 at the census, on average banks were 5.5 kilometers away from people, but that's the national average. So it's obviously shorter distances in the cities and much longer distances in rural areas. So you can look at people who are 10, 15 kilometers away from their nearest bank where they can transact. And how that affects older people, well, there's a variety of ways. I mean, for a start, many people are dependent on car transport. But again, we know that about 40% of older persons who are 65 or older don't have a driving license, particularly women of older age groups. And so as a result, if someone loses the ability to drive, or if a partner passes away and someone is then in the home and they can't drive, getting access to desk services is extremely challenging. We know across a lot of the country, not just rural Ireland, but small towns, there might not be the public transport to get you to the next town. So if the bank in your town closes, your opportunity to get to banks can be really limited. So transport is a big issue. And to pick up the point you said, Brian, people certainly want to be independent. I mean, the vast majority of older persons want to be living in their home, living in the place where they built their lives, in their communities. They want to be looking out for themselves, and they don't want to have to rely on other people. So the really big change which comes in there is the drive to putting everything online. So many banks now, you have to transact online. You have to, you're encouraged to get your statements online. And indeed, you're encouraged to have a smartphone so that you can do authentication of transactions you might make. So that's challenging for a lot of reasons. For a start, Age Action would calculate that about 2/3 of older persons are digitally excluded. And that includes about a quarter of people aged 60 to 74 who are not using the internet. And indeed, more than half of people aged 75 or older are simply not using the internet. And then there's another cohort of each age group who have below basic skills. So when you add all that up, you've got an awful lot of people who are very uncomfortable with the technology they're being asked to use. And things like two-factor authentication on the phone for transactions, it's challenging. And of course, not everybody can afford to have a smartphone or the subscriptions that go with it. Not everybody has a decent internet connection, never mind broadband. So that's a really big challenge that's affecting older persons, because there's an assumption that people would be happy to transact online. And for some people, it's great. They have the skills. But when you look across at all older persons, there's really large numbers of people who are left behind by that.
Thank you, Nat. And John, over to you now. You might just give us an overview of the changes that have already taken place in the sector. And you might put in context the issues that people face, particularly with the exit of Ulster Bank and KBC. You've described their exit as the biggest change in the banking sector since the introduction of the euro. You might just explain and go into a bit of detail about that, please.
So I think just to start in terms of the overview, on my first day in arriving at the job on the 2nd of September 2019, I was met by a colleague who advised that one of the banks had met with him that day and that they wanted to reduce headcount in a particular area by a couple of hundred staff members. And with each wave of redundancy that has come since, it has, I suppose, driven changes, some which are welcome, but many which are not. And the kind of changes that Nat and Sue talked about are usually to the detriment of people. So benefits of better access, better digitization and so forth are all things that people welcome. But they only welcome them if they have choice. And if they have the choice of that blend of operating to a branch model, going in and being able to meet somebody who can meet their needs in terms of whatever part of the cycle on the financial life cycle journey they're on, and get their issues addressed. And I think that the loudest piece that we hear from people is when they have an issue, who or what can they do in order to progress that issue. So there's been consolidation throughout Europe and indeed globally in terms of banking. So Ireland isn't exempt from that. And so there has been some consolidation that has taken place down through the years. If you think back to pre-crash, there was 12, 14 operators in the market, and now we're going to ultimately end up with 3 operators. And in terms of that impacts on competition, but it also impacts on service, in that you have had total withdrawals of banks like Danske Bank from the market, and then you have reductions in terms of number of branches, so therefore the access that people have to service. And even in the last year, 18 months, we've seen 100 branches go on the island of Ireland in Bank of Ireland. In Ulster Bank, when they depart, there's going to be a loss of 53 branches. They have an 88 branch network, and 53 of those are going to close. KBC are going to disappear from the landscape as well at some stage, and AIB themselves have closed branches. So in addition to that, ATMs were outsourced, and you now find yourself in a situation where at times you may have to pay for access to an ATM, and they're not as prevalent and they're not serviced as well as they used to be previously. So it's fairly common now to come to an ATM and find that it's out of order, and discover that it's still out of order the next day. Equally, in terms of digital exclusion, Nat described it very, very well in terms of the impact of digitalization in the banking sector. And our concern at the moment is, with all these changes occurring, and with the 2 banks departing the market, that there's almost a Trojan horse effect of forcing people into a digital realm when they themselves aren't comfortable in that space and don't necessarily want to go into it. Staff in the banks come from a service culture. They come from a culture of liking helping their customers, ensuring that their financial needs are met, that they're purchasing the right products, and that if they have a problem, they have someone to come to and deal with the issues. So in a situation that we're finding ourselves more and more at the moment, where people are excluded, branches are closed, availability is lessened, the hours on the telephone service have been reduced during COVID and have now been made permanent, we feel, from our members' point of view, that's not the type of banking culture that they want to be part of. That's not part of why they sought and pursued a career in finance. They participate in finance in order to work with customers and resolve customers' issues. So neither the staff nor, I would say, the customers are happy where we're landed, and aren't enamored with the direction in which we're going. We think, and more importantly, our members think, that a blended future is the way forward, where people can have access to face-to-face banking supports if that's what they require. And if you're digitally literate and very, capable in terms of doing your banking online and so forth, that should be available to you. But equally, for people who are digitally literate, so will come to periods in their life like mortgage, car loans and things like that, where they'll want to deal with another human being and not deal with an algorithm.
Let me just pick up on a number of the issues that have been raised over the last 20 minutes. And one of these is access to cash. We have branches closing around the country, and we have ATMs withdrawn. And you might walk down your main street, go to your local ATM, and you'll see not an order as a sign that comes up more often than not. In the UK, they have legislation in the works to try and ensure that there's access to cash for all. I just wonder whether that's something we should consider here. Sue, you might just let me know, if I go to you first, whether you think access to cash is a serious issue and a serious concern, particularly for older people.
I think it's a huge issue for older people. And one of our concerns is the reality of what it means not to have access to cash and what you might do instead. I mean, the day of the tin box under the bed is not something anybody wants to return to. And while I don't think things are as drastic as that, I do think people will begin to keep larger amount of money in the house. And that in itself poses certain risks for older people and their security. But I think one of the things we forget about when we talk about the digital piece as well as the access to cash is the reality that even if people are digitally skilled, they still may want their interaction at a local level. Going down the town, taking the cash out of a machine still allows you interact. You're still spending it in a community. So it adds to that sense of there being a community. But I think access to cash is crucial. You know, Nat referred to the reality of transport. And I think for people to be reliant on an infrastructure that isn't always as fully accessible as it should be, that then they're reliant on family members to access their cash. And that in itself can lead to a range of handing over my card to somebody, giving them my number because I'm going into town anyway. Let me pick up your cash for you. And while there may be no intention to abuse, and I'm sure Nat can speak a little bit more about abuse and financial abuse, there still is a reality that people, well-meaning, can begin to take more and more control of older people's finances. So being able to hop up down the town yourself and access the cash is crucial. And I do think we need some legislation to ensure that can happen, because it's all too easy that we feed into the idea of managing things for older people, when in reality they're well able to manage for themselves if service provision is there.
Thank you for that, Sue. I might just go over to you, Nat, on the same question. You've mentioned over 1 million people live in this country who are over 60. Surely access to cash is a real concern for them.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, you know, financial abuse and other types of abuse for older people is a reality. So if you look at the crime statistics, 2% of older people will report being a victim of fraud. And that could be online fraud, it could obviously be paper-based fraud, but in some cases it could also be being defrauded of their resources. Now, you know, thankfully, overall, you know, kind of abuse levels are not excessively high in Ireland compared to other jurisdictions. But if we have the situations we have now, where tens of thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of older persons are moving their bank and having to switch all their details, many of them will be pushed online, and in turn they'll be pushed to rely on friends, family members, even neighbours to help them to do things. And while in the majority of cases that'll be fine, you know, every time you have 1,000 people getting someone else's help, there's the risk that you'll have a couple of cases of people abusing that trust. And of course that adds up to a really large risk that, you know, hundreds of people could find themselves at risk of fraud as part of the switching over process. So fraud is a real concern. And, you know, we've had conversations with people who are, you know, not willing to give up their financial independence to other members of the family. I mean, and for lots of different reasons. It's not always that they don't trust them, but in some cases they just want to do it for themselves. And people don't want to feel that they're a burden on somebody else or requiring their son or daughter to drive over or help them out with things. They want to be able to have control over their finances, which they've had for all of their adult lives. They've been an autonomous, independent citizen, and suddenly their ability to do that has been taken away. So that's a really big concern. So the fraud issue is there. The issue of personal independence is also very strong. And just on the cash, people do get very annoyed when a traditional thing such as going up to a sports match and paying cash, and suddenly they're told, no, cash is no longer available. You have to pay with a plastic card to go cashless, or you have to go to a shop somewhere else to get your ticket. So it seems gratuitous and unnecessary that people can't pay with cash. You see in the bigger urban areas, cafes which have a big notice on the door saying card only, cash not accepted. And while there might have been a bit of that for COVID, for fear of, you know, handling physical money, it just puts up a sign that basically says, if you're someone who just is comfortable using cash and doesn't tap with your card or with your phone, then you just pass that cafe by. And that's very sad, because it creates an exclusion of older persons, and indeed lots of other persons just won't go into that cafe. And that's currently legal. It's legal to say we won't take cash. I checked that with the central bank, as long as they put up a notice. But that's an example where, you know, perhaps we could have law change to say that, you know, people should be required to take cash depending on the type of service. Certainly for a cafe, you think they should be required to take cash. For sporting events, likewise. And then in terms of the ATMs, A lot of this is hidden charges. When someone's on a low income, as many people in older age are, all these charges add up. And if suddenly you're being charged a couple of euro every time you want to take out cash, there is a risk you might take out a bigger lump of cash rather than taking out the small amounts of cash when you need them. Or if you can go less frequently to the ATM, again, you're more likely to take a big lump of cash. And that is its own risk, that people carrying around larger sums of money. Unfortunately, we have seen crime and violent crime against older persons, including cases where people were targeted because they were seen to be taking out a large amount of cash from a cash machine. So there's a lot in there, but there's certainly, I think, scope to look at how people need just the whole traditional banking structure. No one's against change, but at the same time, it has to be in line with meeting people's needs.
And just to go back to you on this, John, Nat tells us that it's not illegal for a sign to go up to say, oh, we only take cash in these premises. Surely there's a place for the central bank here to regulate access to cash. The central bank has a consumer protection code. I'm just wondering, is that not sufficient enough to protect customers from some of these issues that we've discussed today?
I suppose one of the most disappointing features is that when people meet challenges, that they can fall back on whatever the rules of that particular system are. So if we use a taxi, there's a taxi regulator that sets out the standards and the rules that people can expect, and it's fairly contemporary in terms of it's kept up to date. And you get into a taxi now, you can check out from the driver's number, you can check out on the Transport Ireland app and so forth, and you get a sense of security in that you have a qualified driver and so forth with you. So if you translate that into the financial sector, the regulator has a code, a consumer code. Now, unfortunately, it's 10 years out of date, so it's pre-algorithms, pre-mobile apps, pre-Revolut, pre-N26, and all these other neobanks that have popped up. And so consumers are relying on a code that says it's okay to close a branch and give 8 weeks notice and they're out of town. And banks have relied on that code. And equally, it's okay to reduce services, again, notify our customers and just go straight ahead. And when you think in the current context, the reduction, pretty cynically during COVID, of the telephone service to people, and the hours very much restricted and taken away from the weekend and so forth. And now, at the current time, we're seeing on a daily basis complaints from consumers who can't access the telephone, or, as the central bank found, have an average of 2-hour wait to get service, which is just totally unacceptable. So the regulator really needs to step into this space, alongside a lot of the issues that have been outlined. Access to cash. They stepped in during the Christmas in a debate and issued a statement to say that a retailer should accept cash, it's legal tender, but yet they allow banks to go cashless. It just doesn't seem to chime in terms of a consumer-driven regulator. So we think the regulator needs to step into that space and very quickly develop an updated consumer code that starts to address the kind of issues that we're talking about here. Access to cash, digital exclusion, education for people in terms of their finances, and support at times of change. So we very much think that a lot rests with the regulator. You would expect and would hope that the employer themselves, or the entity themselves, as in the banks, would take on these responsibilities. And on occasion they do, but when they fall short, that's where the regulators expect to step in and insist that a standard is adhered to. And currently, as I said, it's out of date, it's not really relevant to today's digitised banking models and the exclusion that people are feeling.
For the last 30 minutes or so, we've highlighted many concerns from the Senior Citizens Parliament, from Age Action, from the FSU, in relation to the changing nature of banking and the whole sector, in relation to the withdrawal of services, in relation to branch closures, access to cash. But before we finish, I'd like to touch on some issues maybe that we can put in place to allay those concerns, to ensure as much as possible that older people, that other customers, that staff are not adversely affected by the changing nature of the sector. I was reading recently about an older person, a 78-year-old pensioner, I think it was, in Spain, who led a campaign against financial exclusion of older people with the rush to the digital age. And this campaign led to an agreement between the economy minister in Spain and the Spanish Banking Association, that when pensioners or older people go into a branch, that they would be given preferential treatment in relation to cashier services and other services. Is this something, Sue, that you think we should explore here? That something the regulator should look at, or particularly something that legislators should look at?
Absolutely. I think, John referenced earlier on that in some cases, banks as entities themselves are recognizing that there are some issues and they're stepping up to that. But overall, they're not. With the best will in the world, we are losing branches. We are looking at lack of choice. We are looking at very little customer-staff relationship happening, particularly as you pointed out, John, over the COVID period, the lack of being able to access your branch even by phone. So I think it really is a space to step up, and I think nobody better than older people to begin that campaign themselves to say, here we are a vibrant element of the community. And of the financial services. Do you know what I mean? We contribute heavily to it. So yes, I think there is a need for both the government and the regulator to step in to ensure that as we have banks exit the market in the high volume that they are, that there are ways of addressing and looking to support people to re-engage in a different way. And for me, I think the bottom line is that if we continue on the road we're doing, it isn't just older people. Like, while I'm very clear that that's who we're representing today, this impacts across a range of communities. The people who are, less advantaged communities, less advantaged, particularly affected by this, people with lack of digital skills, but people who choose. I think somebody referenced earlier the choice element. So I think it is time to start a campaign. It is time to step in and say, pause, let's hold a moment and see where are we now in providing what is a service to a community, to a nation. And I think, unfortunately, that's sadly lacking. So I'm very interested in the campaign and I'll go away and look at it. But definitely, I think it is now time to step up to the plate on that.
Thank you, Sue, and very interesting. And Nat, over to you. I'm not asking you to commit to a campaign now, but I'm just wondering, do you think that's a campaign that Age Action would be interested in supporting?
Certainly, I think it's likely to be a campaign that many older persons will be interested in, and very much I think Age Action will take our marching orders from the concerns that we're hearing from older persons. And there's a number of dimensions in this. I mean, I think in terms of the regulation, I think everybody would like to see some higher standards and some quantitative standards in terms of, maximum waiting times on the phone calls, simplicity of the interface to access, whether it's a phone call, through a phone or through an ATM or whatever it might be. But there's two particular concerns for older persons. One is the accessibility issues. About a third of older people will have some sort of disability or illness, and that'll vary greatly as to what that means. But for some people, it might be a hearing impediment or a sight impediment, and that can affect their ability to use an ATM or on a telephone, particularly the automated voice on a telephone can be very difficult to hear. So there are, good standards for universal design, for accessibility, but whether or not they're being fully implemented and indeed enforced by the regulator, that needs to be looked at, as well, of course, as the physical access to branches and so on. But the other thing is the issue of capacity. As people grow older, some people may need assistance in terms of making decisions. We have the new Assisted Decision Making Capacity Act of 2015, which is being amended this year, will be fully implemented, and we have a new decision support service. Now, what that means is that we'll assume people's capacity and do tests of their capacity and support people to make independent decisions for themselves, rather than the old way where you'd kind of hand over control of your affairs to somebody else, and that would be it forever. So this matters for whatever it might be, 26,000 people at any one time in a nursing home. Some of those people want to continue with their banking. They might want to get their affairs in order. They might want to make certain transactions. And being able to access banking, that's an example of a group of people. Someone in hospital, for example, might want to be able to get access to banking. There are lots of different needs that cohorts within the bigger older person population might need. And that's very much something that could be included in new regulations. And the final point I'd mention is the fact that what actually constitutes a bank might need to be regulated, in the sense that in many cases you walk in the door and it's just a row of machines, and as a security person there who'll point you to a machine and say, work away. But, for some older persons, it could be eyesight, or it could be a literacy issue, or educational disadvantage, whatever it might be. It's not always straightforward for people to make use of those devices. So again, what constitutes a branch could well be something that the regulators need to look at in more detail.
John, I'm sure that's a campaign that the FSU would be very happy to support. But before we finish, I'd just like to bring you back to really where we started, the Ulster Bank and KBC exit from the market. And what do you think the regulators or legislators should be looking at the moment to ensure that older people in particular are not adversely affected by the exit?
Yeah, so I think in terms of, we're fast approaching last bank in town, and in a lot of towns, the length and breadth of the country. And in some towns, indeed, they've lost their banking facility. So I think, very much like Nat was saying, I think there's standards that we should, as a society, start to look to be imposed on the banks. And that is in terms of access to services. Like I said at the beginning, we believe that a blended future is the appropriate future, that we're not in the Luddite category of denying digitization and the benefits that it brings. But for lots and lots of people, that's, a bridge too far. There's been no investment in education. As I said, when a branch closes 8 weeks and the branch has gone out of town, and for anybody that then requires access to bank affairs and so forth, supports should be available, but they're not. The bank is gone, the branch is closed, and it's up for sale within probably the same week as it closes. So I think a lot of it goes back to looking to government, looking to the regulator, and saying, what type of banking model do we want for our citizens, all our citizens, but particularly those citizens who value face-to-face, who value that service model, and have, contributed to the strength and viability of the institutions. Very, very one thing you find in Ireland is the loyalty of people's customers to their banking institutions. And I think there's a responsibility that needs to be laid at the bank's door to ensure that people have that access to cash, access to services, and access to education, so that people can be brought on the journey and feel much more comfortable than they do currently. There's one bank at the moment that you'd win a prize if you could find the phone number on it. You can go into it, it'll tell you contact the branch, you go onto the branch, it'll direct you to put in your query to a robot and so forth. That's not reasonable access for people in terms of when they have a difficult or a basic query. People need to be able to get an answer to their query and get support for what the issues that are there. So we very much welcome a campaign, number one, and support a campaign, number two, in terms of following on the lead from our colleague in Spain and demanding a certain level of service is available to people when they come into a branch or on the phone, indeed, as Nat identified, that there's a certain level of service that is to a high standard. These banks are now back into the €1 billion profit category. And, in terms of the kind of expenditure we're talking about, is minimal against that backdrop. So it's something that's well within the grasp if the willingness is there and if the drive and the push and the pull from government and regulator are part of that campaign.
Unfortunately, we seem to have run out of time. But before we sign off, just maybe to review some of the issues that were raised. We talked about access to cash We talked about financial independence of elderly people. We talked about branch closures, the withdrawal of ATMs. These are some of the issues that clearly have to be addressed going forward. And I'm sure this discussion will carry on over the next number of months. There's a banking review happening at the moment in the Department of Finance. And I'm sure there's a roundtable discussions happening at the end of April. I'm sure all these concerns will be raised at that meeting. We may also have seen the beginning of a campaign, similar to the campaign run by the pensioner in Spain. We need to ensure that older people are protected when change is happening. We need to ensure, I think, that stakeholders are involved in the decision making about how that change occurs. But look, as I said, this discussion, I think, will run and run and run. I'd like to thank, before signing off, Nat O'Connor, Sue Shaw, and John O'Connell for joining me today. Thank you.